So my goal is in emotional intelligence is not to make people nicer. It's really to show that emotional intelligence and emotions, feelings, it's a data point. And so instead of avoiding it and pretending like they don't exist, we now shift it into understanding it is a real data point that actually affects your decisions.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Reanimated Stories. This is Roger from Reanimation Design, and today I am joined by Dana. And Dana and I have also met through networking. As you've probably noticed through my podcast, I have mentioned that quite a few times. So if by this point you have not realized that networking works, yes, it works. And you meet some awesome people like Dana. So Dana, thank you so much for joining me today on my podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Dana and we had actually met at another networking event, and then we just kind of kept the conversation going, and she does some really interesting things. So I try not to give away what you do at the beginning of the podcast. I always like you to be able to speak to it. So Dana, tell us a little bit about what you do.
Absolutely. Well, I am the founder of Inspire. My background is in HR and learning and development. And throughout that time span, I worked with many different organizations who identified problems that they were building trainings for. Often it's called accountability issues or conflict issues. And everyone has a different name for it. But what I saw time and time again was it all came back to the root of emotional intelligence. And so that is kind of where Inspire was born. And I help grow leaders with high emotional intelligence. And I had, do that through various workshops, assessments, tools to give them that data points to really narrate and direct kind of where to go, rather so they can respond rather than just react to what's in front of them.
That's really cool. You know, the idea or the word or the phrase, emotional intelligence, I feel, especially since probably, 2020 has really come into play. People are always, talking about that. But can you talk to us a little bit about emotional intelligence and how that kind of plays into what you're doing?
So I love it. And I'm gonna pivot and come back to your question for a second
Yeah.
because I love your call out of 2020 because really my work in particularly highlights how the role of leadership itself has shifted. It's the fundamentals of what we expect as leaders are of course are there, but the expectations have completely gone awry and it needs to evolve because that system that we've worked and built leaders up for over the last couple decades isn't working anymore. And really that catalyst of that shift started with the pandemic. Back in 2020, when all of a sudden, for the first time in most adults' lives, we had an opportunity to step. And for most of us, I know I speak to somebody almost every other week who talks about that pandemic and how they really actually enjoyed it. Now, when they look back, they enjoyed it in the sense that they found clarity in one aspect of their life or another. And when we think about that, that really translates into leadership in general. It was the first time that people had an opportunity to step back and feel the weight of what they've been carrying and what they've been doing. And the workforce completely changed from then on out. We came back and all of a sudden it's a remote world. And now as organizations and leaders, we're having to adapt to a workforce that expects flexibility as a fundamental core, where, of course, that old leadership model, those old organizational models really didn't account for that as much. And that pivot on top of not only the shift to remote, then we bring in AI, and all of a sudden, all the knowledge is there on the tool when we're really now requiring emotional intelligence to be the piece. So when I talk about what is emotional intelligence, I have some people who will when I first start talking about it, they'll joke with me and be like, "Why are you trying to help me with my marriage?" That's not emotional intelligence. It will help you with your marriage, you are right, but that's not really the fundamental piece. So, my goal is in emotional intelligence is not to make people nicer. It's really to show that emotional intelligence and emotions, feelings, it's a data point. And so instead of avoiding it and pretending like they don't exist, we now shift it into understanding it is a real data point that actually affects your decisions. So the ultimate goal is to bring in, again, this is where AI has exposed this gap so much, bring in trust, judgment, discernment as fundamental leadership pieces. And those all root in emotional intelligence is first understanding yourself, knowing where and how you respond in real time, pausing, again, just like that moment in the pandemic, taking that opportunity to pause and experience and then kind of act accordingly. So again, that's it, emotional intelligence in a nutshell as far as where I'm aiming to grow organizations and leaders into that future of leadership.
That is really cool. It's interesting because until you said it, I didn't really like think about it. But yeah, you're right. Like the pandemic did it had us all kind of take a step back and kind of evaluate where we were at, and that's a really interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel like you could do a whole episode on that. I'm sure a lot of people have, but that's a really interesting. And it got me thinking because you're talking here about leaders and you're saying like, well, they got everybody to kind of take a step back, and now there's kind of like this level of trust that's been lost, and now with AI and all that, how have you seen, since you work with leaders a lot, how has okay, let me see how I can form the question correctly to what I'm saying. How have you seen leaders that were from before the pandemic, during and after the pandemic, how have they changed? And do you see, and this might be kind of like a loaded question, but do you see how the ones that maybe became leaders during the pandemic versus before the pandemic, how they might have changed, and like how they've kind of adjusted to that, to the
Absolutely.
after, I mean?
So this is one of the things that I want to pause. And then again, I'm sorry to keep navigating your question, but because what I think a lot of people get wrong is, particularly within organizations, is they put so much weight of individual leaders of saying, this is what expectation is. You must reach here to get there. That's not realistic. Gallup found 1 in 10 individuals have natural leadership skills. So unless we're providing adequate training, people do not just step up to leadership. And again, this is where my work, it really highlights it's a system problem, not just, you know, individual work. Yes, both are required for really this shift to happen. And so when we talk about prior, before pandemic, how organizations particularly focused on growing leaders was two key pieces. First, they looked at who was their high performers, who did their job really well, and those people got promoted into management and leadership skills. And then what they find out is it is a whole different skill set to be a leader than it is just to be good at your job. And particularly when we talk about leadership, leadership is not about your work anymore. When we talk about the technical skills required to do a job, that's really about looking at the work of one, zooming in and talking about what can I do, what are my deliverables, and so on. When we talk about leadership skills, it's about amplifying the work of many. And so
Mm,
that's really that shift. And what organizations now need to focus on is the amplifying of many through leadership development skills versus the technical skills. Again, the EQ versus TQ kind of components. But so the kind of prior to the pandemic, again, that was the catch was who's the most knowledgeable, who knew the work, who drives the deliverables. And again, those were the people who were promoted and then asked to get their team to do that. And I worked in a number of organizations where I saw those kind of technical skill leaders. And what's interesting is it's not something that easily shows up on a dashboard for executives to see. They might see this leader and think that, oh, they're really high performer because their team is delivering so much so quickly, but they're not really looking at all data points of what is costing them secretly in a more quiet spectrum. And what you can actually map out pretty clearly, and I challenge any leader who watches this to go in their organization and map this, to look at trust and high emotional intelligence, and you will directly see the results of retention within an organization. So when you talk about anyone who's had like that just that high emotional intelligence leader, that's not something people give up easily. When you've had a really good leader in your corner, people do not leave that. People do not leave organizations, they leave management. And so that looking at that
Wow.
retention number is that secret cost, and it's your actual highest cost in an organization. And so flipping it to today, when we look at the leaders who are really stepping in to this new evolution of leadership, there comes to a couple components. And I hate to bring up AI so much, but it's just such a pinnacle piece
Yeah.
of the shift. And I feel like there's two people who are looking at AI right now. There's the people who are panicked, who are fear of, oh my gosh, everything's changing, what's happening. And then there are people who are looking at it and seeing the opportunity. And really, in my work, I see that opportunity because emotional intelligence, the data for emotional intelligence is not new. It has been around for decades that shows high emotional intelligence leaders deliver better performance, more revenue, lower retention. Google Aristotle found psychological safety to be the number one contributor to high performing teams. So, again, this is data that has been collected for decades. But now AI has exposed it into a way that we no longer can ignore it because we no longer can go in the old avenue of promoting people who knew it all or who were just good at the job. And now we're required to look at leaders who can amplify the work of many. And so, again, speaking to those leaders who do that are the ones that really embrace emotional intelligence. And I can go on, but really the one piece I really love to talk about with leaders is talking about what their aha moment was when they figured that out, where they really found that emotional intelligence skills was the piece missing for being a great leader, not just a good leader, but a great leader within their organization.
I think that that's really cool. You brought out a really good point when you said that, it's one thing to kind of like know the job as like just a worker. And then you all of a sudden you get kind of thrust into, you get thrust into greatness, right? And by going to being a leader. And then all of a sudden I think that's so crucial what you said, that it's not about your work anymore. It's about how can you amplify others' work, because you may not, as a leader, you may be overseeing the work, but you're not necessarily doing that work. And I think that that's a really big, I think that that's a huge component that I feel anyway with, with what limited, experience I've had. I've seen that a lot. When somebody becomes a leader, they may, depending on the organization, right, how big it is, they may be doing the work still. But, once you kind of get to a certain point, they're not necessarily doing that. And so it's one thing to know how to do the job, but then it's like, how do you then go above that and kind of, or maybe not above that, but kind of take that next step of, okay, now I'm overseeing all the work, and how can I help others amplify their work that I was doing. You had mentioned you had just mentioned something, about AI, and AI is kind of amplifying that, and people are either like, "Oh no, I'm scared of it," or, they're finding, opportunities, or maybe there's something kind of in the middle as well. But you had talked about these assessments that you're helping these businesses with and companies. What are some of the assessments that you're doing, and how are you kind of helping them kind of navigate through all of that?
Great question. So I use a number of frameworks, some of my own, some, well established frameworks out there. One of the pieces that I like to bring up is the first one, which I encourage everyone to look up after this call. It's the trust equation. This is by Charles Green. I find this so interesting because most people don't realize you can put a numeric number to trust and really understand that data point within yourself, within your organization. And so, just to briefly caveat it, it's looking at what is credibility, reliability, intimacy, and divide it by self orientation. That's the equation. Again, everyone can look it up and discover their trust score from there. But so that's one of the frameworks that I like to utilize to help organizations measure where their trust is within their employees and within individual managers. Another tool that I utilize, so that's just one of them, but another tool that I utilize within actually stepping into my program, which my flagship program, I have a number of offerings, but my flagship's called an EQ Lab, and it's meant for cohorts within an organization of people leaders. And the baseline measurement I use there is EQI 2.0 assessment through MHS. So that actually helps leaders measure 5 different components. It's self-perception, self-expression, interpersonal relationships, decision making, and stress management. And what's really fascinating about emotional intelligence assessment is it's actually not about having a high score. I know that's kind of innate in all of us that we want to be the best at whatever we take. That's not the goal. We aim for you to get at least mid-level, but from there, it actually does not matter whether you're high or not. It's more important to find balance across those 5 different composites. Because, especially when we talk about leadership, what I'll find as just a easy an example is there might be leaders who are really high in interpersonal relationship skills, but they're low in decision-making skills. What I can tell you about that leader, if I saw that result, I can tell you that leader is someone 9 times out of 10 will most likely default to the crowd's opinion rather than use
Oh.
their strategic position to make the actual clear best call. And so that's the kind of data points that I help organizations see within their leaders to navigate what to next. And again, that through that lab, we workshops and individual coaching to really affect behavioral change, not just the surface level awareness.
That's really interesting that you can kind of catch that, but that does make sense because someone like, well, I don't really want to make a decision, and then it's like, let's ask everybody else and all of that. That's really interesting. To have that level. Do you also look at, because I know there's a ton of other ones like DISC and DISC. I know that there's a lot of
There's
other
DISC, there's
assessments. Yeah,
Berkman, there's
yeah, yeah,
Myers-Briggs.
yeah. There
There's
you go.
many out there, and I
Yeah,
mean, I'm a big component of assessments. I love it.
yeah.
And one of the pieces when I built leadership development programs for many organizations throughout my career, and when you're specifically talking to C-suite or stakeholders, the ask, what they really want you to put into the leadership development programming is often about leading teams and it's about leading the business. But the first piece that a lot of people miss is the foundation, and it's the most fundamental piece, and it's how to lead yourself. And
Mm,
this is where emotional intelligence work and these assessments, all, name whatever assessment you want, these are where they live. It gives leaders the opportunity to see themselves where they're at so that they can lead themselves forward. Because how can you expect to lead a team if you can't lead yourself?
yeah. That's who was it? I think it was, well, Socrates or something like that, but it was Aristotle. You have to know thyself before you can even do anything. So that's really good, because if you walk into a leadership position, if you're walking into an organization to something and you don't know how you lead, you don't know how you're you don't know like you're leading, like you're not going to know how to lead others, and if you can't lead yourself, that's extremely important. Walk me through some of as you're walking through those assessments, what are some things that you're starting to hear and that you're starting to notice? And do they kind of evolve as you are, seeing teams, or how does that kind of work?
Well, the one catch I want to share, really, let me start by talking about what I'm hearing from organizations, and I'll get into the work that I'm doing
Yeah.
with leaders. When I'm talking to, you know, HR professionals or people looking at the organizational map of their company, what they're finding, especially since the pandemic, is that leadership pipeline is slowly going away. And the reason is because the younger generation is seeing what leadership meant in the past and is like, I don't want that. So they're not,
Wow.
what's interesting is they're not really avoiding leadership skills itself because one of the first questions I ask people when I talk about career pathing with them is I ask them if they envision themselves a people leader. It's one of those things you kinda either have a gut reaction, you're like, "Yeah, I can see myself leading other people," or not. That hasn't changed. What's changed is people are avoiding burnout, and that's really,
Mm.
again, that the system of leadership has put so much on leaders rather than building the system that supports them. And so my work when I work in organizations is building a system within the organization that supports leadership. And that's why the work itself is not just, although I have EQI assessments as an individual, someone can reach out to me and I can offer that. My work is really meant for within an organization to build that cohort community of leaders who can support each other through the this shifts. And really, when I look at the roadmap of working with leaders, I work from first is awareness. I've already stated how important that is kind of first analyzing that. Then we get into alignment of taking that awareness and connecting the dots within the organization's priorities and connecting the dots to those that they lead. And then finally we step into integration. So how do we take all of this work that we've worked on and translate it forward? How do we take the 3-month program and continue it past that? And that's about building habits and conditions that really make things inevitable. It's, one of my favorite things to do at the beginning of the year is to set new conditions. I know everyone talks about goal setting, but goals are aspirational. They're great. When you build in conditions, that is when you make things inevitable. And so that's this final piece of the program is building the conditions that make showing up with emotional intelligence inevitable, not just a nice to have outcome.
Yeah. That's real quick. I want to kind of go back real quick because you had mentioned about how kind of the younger generation is not necessarily wanting to kind of be a leader, but you're seeing it more as a shift of not that we don't want to be a leader, but I just don't want to be a leader like how I've seen leaders before. And so they're not really wanting to kind of, so there's kind of this idea, if I hear right, is that they're kind of trying to shift that. They're kind of like, hey, I don't mind being a leader, but I don't want to have to do like I'm seeing that this is leading to this outcome and I don't want to and I don't want that. And so they're kind of evolving it to kind of fit what they're like, they not that they don't want to do the work. They just don't want to have that the end result that they've seen others. So how has that shift kind of happened and changed?
So I love it because it just like full circles this whole conversation because it goes back to the pandemic and what we saw happen. Because again, the shift in leadership has asking more on leaders and how organizations have responded is through flexibility. They really have policies that they leave it to the manager's discretion. So all
Mm,
of a sudden, there's so much weight on leaders, much more weight than there used to be as far as how to navigate things. It's put on, again, the manager's shoulders to basically be the emotional shock absorber of
yeah.
whatever's happening, whether that's someone who wants to work remote one day or a personal crisis or just kind of how someone operates or works at their best. And we're asking managers to essentially be the best coaches while also delivering the same deliverables as before and also all the other many responsibilities that a leader requires. So again, we're just asking leaders to do so much
Yeah.
more with even less structure from an organization standpoint supporting them. And so naturally so many leaders are being burnt out from
Yeah.
that experience that they're stepping back that I don't want to deal with that anymore. Another clear example is unlimited PTO is another great one where again it
Oh,
sounds great, but it's shifting actually the responsibility of taking time off
yeah.
onto the managers to make the discretion rather than the organization system. Uh,
Oh, geez.
so again, it's just one of those many new kind of coming of age policies that have transitioned over the years that ultimately puts more weight on leaders rather than the structure within the organization.
Well, now I gotta know. So what is unlimited PTO? How does that work? So you just it's not like, okay, well, you have 4 weeks this year, you can take as much time as you want, or how does that
Yeah.
work?
So a lot of organizations, particularly after the pandemic, this is before the pandemic too, but a lot of
Oh,
organizations shifted to unlimited PTO. And the reason, honestly, it's for cost for an organization, it saves them money
okay,
from
okay.
paying out PTO at the end of the year and allows
Oh, okay.
people to take as much time as they want with the catch that their manager now has to approve. So all of
Okay.
um, the unintended consequences that organizations didn't really consider when they shifted that model is how much now that puts it on the weight of the manager to be fair, consistent
Yeah.
across their organization rather than the policy be 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks.
Yeah.
Let's go to Europe and go to 6 weeks, that kind of thing.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, no, okay, so that makes a lot more sense. So instead of the manager being like, "All right, well, you've had, you're allotted this amount of time. You only have this much time. If you take, you can't go beyond this." Now they have to look at it and be like, they got to do all this mental math and figure out, okay, well, Jan said this, and then Dave said that, and okay, and then this, but oh my gosh, yeah, that would be no, thank you. Oh my goodness.
Exactly, and again, it's all about now that weight of being fair and
Yeah,
consistent and all is we've erased that's just, again, a very easy example to showcase the racial of the conditions that supported managers to make clear and fair decisions, and now it's all kind of left to
yeah.
managers to make that discretion.
Oh man, that kind of stresses me out just to kind of think about that. Good night. Oh my gosh. Well, Dana, let's say that somebody was hearing your conversation and was thinking, okay, my leaders, they need to know, they need to know themselves before they can lead. I want to make sure that my team is strong. I also want to get people more of that opportunity. What are some of the questions that they need to start thinking of if they're thinking, hey, maybe I should reach out to Dana, or just start thinking about this process in general to have a stronger foundation for their leaders and managers and a company as a whole?
Yeah, so I did build a leadership effectiveness snapshot tool, which people can reach out, and it's a free assessment that I can offer people to give them real data to show where their organization currently sits when we look at trust, emotional intelligence, and leadership effectiveness. And what's great is, again, that can really tell you what's at risk. What a lot of people find the surprising outlier, again, happens to be emotional intelligence. And which is, it is so great that people are starting to use the language of emotional intelligence. I love that, but they're still not quite pivoted to the point of taking action. And so what we still treat it as organizations, we still treat it so much as a nice to have, like, oh, hopefully my leader has great high emotional intelligence,
Yeah.
or hopefully my leader built has good trust with their team. We treat them like they're nice to have. And when you shift your perspective and see them as driving force for your organization, everything really goes up from
Yeah.
then on. When you focus on building high trust, high emotional intelligence environments, you will see that, again, you'll see it in your revenue, you'll see it in your performance, you'll see it in your retention. And so giving people that data point to see that. And I think that's, again, one of the biggest catches of this age is reshifting our the belief, the myth that emotional intelligence has nothing to do with decisions. In reality, emotions show up in every decision that you make. And so let's no longer ignore that. Let's give the data to actually do something with it.
Yeah, that is, yeah, you hit the nail right on the head. And, like, for us to think that, like, oh, we can just make a decision without any sort of emotional attachment behind it or anything like that. Yeah, no, yeah, it's important to have that because without that, they're just kind of like, well, I mean, how would somebody make, like you just said with the unlimited PTO, how is somebody supposed to, make that sort of decision without, also having some emotion behind it, even if it's, trying to think about how am I going to be fair? How am I going to take PTO? Right? I was so and so.
And
Yeah.
again, there's a million and one decisions that a manager makes
Yeah.
every single day.
Yeah.
I do not expect them to pause and exhibit every single micro thing to understand the depth of each emotion. What I'm trying to highlight is first just being, when you become more aware of these emotions in the background, you you are able to catch when you're no longer operating in a clear space. And so that's really the moment. I'm not asking everyone for every single decision to analyze it so thoroughly to say, oh, is this the, but what we're really trying to do is give them the tools and awareness to be able to think more clearly, make better judgment and clearer discernment when it comes to all the million things that a leader has to do.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't want them to get stuck in analysis paralysis, but you want them to be kind of aware of what they're doing. Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. Well, Dana, it has been fantastic having you here. So I appreciate it. If somebody is looking to connect with you online, where can they find you online? When they get to your website, what is it that you want them to do? Where can they find you online?
Yeah, so please add me on LinkedIn, Dana Echert, and you can go to my website at www.inspireskillstraining.com. And, not only do I offer a number of really great tools to help people really get into the space, even if it's just that EQ entry suite of let's just get the data point of that EQI assessment and working with my team with a workshop. Maybe you're not ready for that full behavioral change model of the EQ lab, but not only do I have those services, I also, along the way, I realized I didn't want to just help grow leaders to with high emotional intelligence. I also want to give a platform to highlight those who are already operating it. And so I also started the Inspire Leaders Spotlight series to spotlight those who really exhibit this in this day and age. So you can go on and
Awesome.
nominate someone for, if you have a really compelling story of a leader in your background who, again, when you have a high emotional intelligence leader, you know it.
Yeah.
And normally it comes with really great stories. So
Yeah.
those are the type of stories that I want to hear and collect as well.
Oh, well, that's really awesome. Yeah. Well, we'll have all of that in the description for the show notes. So that's really cool. Yeah. I encourage everyone to check that out and nominate someone because that's really awesome. That's a really great opportunity. Well, Dana, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. It was great having you, and I look forward to continuing our conversations. And please check out what Dana is doing. And thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.